Welcome to A Quaker Take on Climate Change. A Quaker Take is a podcast from Quakers in Britain exploring a Quaker perspective on the world.
I'm John.
And I'm Elizabeth.
Climate change, big old topic. So big a topic, in fact, that this is a double episode, as in part one of two parts. I mean, we've never done it before, but...
We got so excited that we interviewed so many different people, and then we didn't want to cram it all into one episode, so we decided to split it into two. So this one is on generally a Quaker take on climate change.
Yes, we're going to explore different things that Quakers are doing on climate change, the initial kind of why is this an issue that Quakers care about, and then we're going to move on to part two, which is...
talking about kind of the new climate movement and climate activism and the way that that looks today. So talking about Extinction Rebellion, talking about the school strikes for the climate, and also talking in more in depth about what climate justice means.
Yeah, and we've got some really cool interviews on there, including with somebody who founded Extinction Rebellion Jews and some young Quakers who were involved in the climate strikes and all sorts of awesome stuff. So
that is coming up in the next episode.
Get hyped, and it will be very soon. But let's not say when, because this is not the most punctual podcast right now. And we apologise, but hey, we're making it up to you. 2 episodes.
Yeah, 2 in 1. You know. And so today we are talking to Susanna Mattingly, who is from the International Body of Quakers, and they've been part of a project that's kind of been looking at what Quakers around the world have been doing on climate change in their different areas. And that looks quite different depending where you are, but we'll talk to Susanna a little bit more about that.
Yes, and then you've been catching up with Livy, who works here on our climate work in Britain.
Yeah, so she is talking about what the Quakers in Britain take on climate activism looks like, and about things like a just transition to a greener economy and how we can rethink some of those things, and a little bit about kind of the ethics and the background to why we do this work as well and why we think it's important.
Awesome. But first, let's hear from Susanna about all the stuff that Quakers are doing around the world on climate change.
We're here with Susanna Mattingly. Susanna, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I work for the international Quaker body called Friends World Committee for Consultation, abbreviated to FWCC for short. We represent Quakers all around the world. There are about 400,000 Quakers across the globe in 87 different countries, and about 50% of the world's Quakers live in the Africa section. So we divide the world sort of roughly into 4 sections. We have the section of the Americas, which includes all of North, Central and South America, Europe and the Middle East section, the Africa section, which as I said is the largest section, and the Asia West Pacific section.
Well, one of the reasons we're talking to you today is because the issue of climate change, climate justice is quite global, and is it something that the FWCC have been thinking about for a while, or is it something that's just come up on their radar?
I mean, yeah, this work is definitely not new. It's been happening within the Quaker world for a long time. It's quite amazing to see actually how long we've been talking about this and had a really clear voice on this issue.
So what is it that meant that sort of Quakers worldwide came together on this as something that they all wanted to work on?
I mean, there were a couple of quite key global Quaker commitments that were made in recent years at the World Gathering of Friends. So there was, in 2012, there was a world conference, Kenya, and out of that came something called the Kabarak Call for Peace and Eco-Justice. And it's a really powerful and moving statement about climate change, ecological disruption, what's happening really around the world to our Quaker family and to nature in general. And then I think people felt that to sort of build on that needed to go a little bit further and come up with some sort of actions for Quakers. And so in 2016, the PSAC Sustainability Minute was approved at the 2016 World Conference of Friends. And that kind of built on the Kabarak Call, used that as inspiration, but specifically asked yearly meetings around the world to come up with 2 concrete actions on sustainability. And now this new project that FWCC is running is sort of building on these commitments at the global level and trying to engage more Quakers around the world more deeply on the issue of sustainability. And we're also trying to help articulate the spiritual basis for this concern, because that is something that ties Quakers together across cultural, theological, geographical, language divides.
What are the kinds of things that Quakers around the world are doing then?
We're seeing a whole range of different responses, and obviously the context in different countries is very different. So one thing that we're noticing is there's definitely no sort of one-size-fits-all approach, and it's not for us as FWCC to say this is the action that you should be taking as a Quaker meeting or as an individual friend. Increasingly, lots of Quakers are seeing climate change and understanding it as a peace and justice issue. And we hear lots of Quakers talking about climate justice. And I mean, we can see when we're looking at the international level that climate change is the main cause of climate change is high consumption. But those who are most responsible for that really are the ones feeling the worst impacts of climate change. And actually, it's the communities who are most reliant upon the land, their livelihoods, and those communities that are already vulnerable to rising sea levels and extreme weather events and natural disasters who are bearing the brunt of this. So that's certainly the picture we're seeing among Quakers worldwide.
And so that's why Quakers see it as a justice issue rather than just being about saving the planet.
Yeah, many Quakers. I mean, that's not necessarily how all Quakers approach it. There are other Quakers who, I mean, for example, some evangelical Quakers who would much prefer probably to talk about kind of stewardship of the earth and protecting God's creation. And the climate justice language wouldn't really necessarily be something they would use.
Okay.
But ultimately what we're kind of noticing is that whatever our motivations for coming towards this, the end goal is the same. And we are noticing that increasingly Quakers are kind of coming together and uniting on this issue across these kind of divides in our community. So
what kind of differences are there worldwide in Quakers?
So, I mean, there's a really, really broad spectrum theologically within Quakers. So there are sort of, perhaps at one end you have the liberal, unprogrammed Quakers like we have here in Britain.
So unprogrammed being the silent meters.
Silent worship, yes, you don't have somebody sort of in charge leading the service. But then you also have programmed Quakers where you're more likely to have maybe a minister or a pastor leading the session. It might look a lot more like a church to people, often sit in rows rather than in the circle. People sit in unprogrammed worship, and that will probably be a lot more biblically based. There'll be a lot more biblical language. And then at the other end of the spectrum we have evangelical Quakers who want to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we all exist within this spectrum somewhere, and there are political differences and cultural differences, but actually there's also a lot that does unite us. And the work of FWCC is about building understanding amongst the Quaker world particularly, and we're seeing that this is an issue where friends are increasingly coming together to work positively on this shared concern in a way that we haven't really done before, so it's quite exciting.
Yeah. And we were just talking before we turned the microphone on about different like case studies and stuff. So do you have any like concrete examples of how it might look different or similar in different parts of the world?
One of the things we're doing at FWCC is gathering stories from Quakers around the world about not only their responses to climate change and the sort of sustainability challenges, but also about their experiences of climate disruption in different parts of the world. And so the responses we've received kind of range from very, very small, simple actions that a particular meeting or an individual friend might be taking, right up to larger, more complex projects. So we've been speaking to Quakers in Rwanda, and they're working with church communities in rural areas particularly to try and make Rwanda more resilient to the impacts of climate change. They've set up something called the Forever Green Rwanda Friends Initiative, which promotes sustainable farming practices, water preservation, soil management, tree planting on church land and at home. Also anti-erosion measures for those living in mountainous areas, and promoting the use of solar energy and shifting from electricity to biofuels. So it's a really wide-ranging project. And although it's been inspired by the PSAC Minute and the call to take action, they have explained that it also ties in with lots of initiatives, government initiatives in the country to sort of help make the country greener. So it's an interesting collaboration between.
Yeah. So what is it in particular that means that like in Rwanda there's such a sort of like push to do more on climate change?
They've been affected by droughts and by landslides recently, and kind of various natural disasters which have been exacerbated by climate change. I think farming is under threat, so I think it's just a very present issue for them.
Cool, that's interesting.
There's another story from Quakers in Bolivia, which has been hit by severe droughts in recent years, and this has obviously been exacerbated by climate change, but reduced snowfall and the retreating glaciers in the Andes Mountains means that they're failing to provide enough running water to the cities below.
Okay.
And a few Quakers volunteers actually set up the Friends International Bilingual Centre in Bolivia a few years ago, and it runs educational programs for children, young people and adults on social concerns, and particularly focusing on stewardship of creation, as they call it. And after a particularly prolonged drought in 2016, where La Paz, the city, was without water for several months, the centre ran a programme for the students on the challenges posed by climate change and practical ways they could help others who are affected. So it's a really interesting project.
So what are the kinds of things that came out of that educational programme?
Some of the children ran educational stalls in town halls and in the public squares, raising awareness of this, and they had a lot of visitors come up to the stall to learn. This was particularly around the issue of water, and I think they have now built this into their kind of main curriculum as something that they just always need to be teaching people about, because it's just such a present issue for them.
So what happens when there is a drought? What happens to the water supply?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's not enough. So, I mean, there are some people who will be all right. Some people will be able to afford to buy water, but there are a lot of people who will not be able to buy water and who will end up drinking dirty water, not drinking water. Certainly, like limited water on washing your clothes, washing yourselves. So I think it kind of affects everything that you do in your daily life, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think I take for granted just how much water I use, and
yes.
I mean, certainly my life in Britain as well,
Yeah.
like how much that takes up.
We never have to think about it. We turn the tap on and it's there. Yeah.
Do you have an example from Europe and the Middle East?
I do have a really nice example from Europe at the Middle East section. There's a group called the Europe and Middle East Young Friends, known as EMIF, and they get together across Europe and the Middle East section, usually once a year, but at other times as well, for sort of a specific gathering. And they dedicated their whole gathering in Poland in 2017 to the issue of sustainability. A primary concern for their community was travel and how they get to their gatherings, and it was the area they felt they could have the most direct impact on by helping to make that more sustainable. So they committed to several practical ways to help friends get to the gatherings sustainably and specifically to avoid air travel. One example of this is they are encouraging people to travel in groups to the gatherings to make the longer journeys more enjoyable, and to also offer support for people who would feel uncomfortable doing that on their own. They share information with each other about cheap train tickets and offers that come up in the run-up to their gatherings. And they're also exploring providing partial bursaries to friends to help cover the additional cost of taking the train or travelling over land rather than by air, because we know that's a huge barrier to a lot of people, is the additional cost of travelling in a more sustainable way.
And are trains really that much better than planes?
I love them. I have enjoyed doing some really, really long train journeys. Environmentally, yes, they are so much better.
Okay.
If you can swap out one flight for a train, you'll have a huge impact.
I think that will surprise some people. I mean, I
Yeah.
was talking to someone at the weekend about the Greta event and her not flying here and stuff, and it was like, oh, how much difference can it make? Like, it's the same distance, but actually I think it's quite a big difference.
It's huge, and particularly even, I mean, what's surprising often is the shorter flights. It's the takeoff and the landing that uses the most fuel. So yes, I mean, a transatlantic flight is worse than a short haul flight, but also the impact of a short haul flight is huge, because it's the landing and the taking off that burns the most fuel. So I don't actually have the exact figures to hand, but I know that it is far better to take the train if you can, but it is more expensive, and so finding ways to support people to make those choices whilst the policy is not caught up
Yeah.
to make sense.
So it must help to have all different people from different countries as well, because one of the barriers for me would be like language. Like I remember once I
Yes.
got a train from London to like Holland, and even just that really simple, straightforward, it was still like you've got to go through the different countries and work out how the ticket systems work in different places.
But from now, London to Amsterdam is one ticket on the Eurostar.
That's true.
So
Very
it's
good.
a through now,
That's nice.
which is nice.
And as soon as you're out of Britain, the trains are great. They're like, run on time.
We don't have to tell me if
Yeah,
to
loads of-
Switzerland enough times.
At least in Europe, maybe less so in the States.
Yeah,
Yes,
but
America.
certainly in Europe.
Is that a beautiful transition over to American friends?
Very good, very good. Nicely done. So I heard just last week from a meeting in New England in the US, Hartford monthly meeting, who were telling me that 12 members of their monthly meeting in Connecticut in the States have joined other Quakers in New England in their voluntary carbon tax witness. And so since 2014, they've been tracking their fossil fuel use from things like driving and heating their homes, taking flights and using electricity. And they pledge a self-imposed tax, which is then collected quarterly by this group. And so each individual can decide how much they want to pledge, and the pledge is private, it's confidential. But importantly, the witness, the action of doing this is public, and it's done specifically in support of legislation to implement a carbon tax. So people are sort of starting to call for this. And then at the end of each quarter, the group meet up and decide on an organisation that they will donate the funds to. And this can be a local or a national group, and it will be somebody working on issues reducing the impact of climate change. So it's a really simple action, but actually quite powerful, and has a sort of public witness about why we're doing this and what we're hoping for. But it also allows them to fund and donate to work in support of tackling climate change.
It's quite cool.
Yeah, and that seems like quite an important thing in terms of even just acknowledging the impact that your own personal lifestyle has on some of those things, as well as pushing for the more sort of like government-led change as well. Are Quakers around the world kind of divided on the difference between like working on individual stuff and working on the sort of system change stuff, or is it kind of a bit of both, that people are kind of doing some of the same kind of things but it just looks different in different countries?
From my perspective, I think they have to go hand in hand. One without the other is not going to achieve the change we need. And so Quakers are among groups, other faith groups, calling for bolder policy leadership. But we also recognise that behaviour change and lifestyle change for a large part of the world is also really important. I mean, some people will be particularly focused on a particular issue. Maybe that's like a plant-based diet or a no-fly movement, or lobbying politicians. But I think we can see pretty clearly that this has to be a kind of a broad approach, and all of this has to be part of the solution.
Should we do the final section? What is it? West Asia, West Pacific?
Asia West Pacific section,
Okay.
which it covers actually a lot of different countries and a lot of different languages and traditions. So they are quite a challenge in that regard, but they're also part of the world which are really feeling the impacts of climate change often, and they are very active on this issue. I've got a specific story I can share from India, and again this focuses on water. In parts of India, lots of people are drinking polluted water from rivers and from wells, and waterborne diseases are pretty common. And Quakers have been working in rural areas to provide clean drinking water and help improve the health in villages. And there's an organisation in the Friends Rural Centre in Hoshangabad in India which runs the Biosand Water Filter Project, which provides clean water to local villages, and it's supported by Friendly Water for the World, which is another organisation. And essentially the untreated dirty water is poured into the top of the device, and it then filters through this layer of sand and gravel, and it removes about 99% of bacteria. And the Friends Rural Centre is training people to make these water filters and to sell them and to maintain them. They're really easy to make. The raw materials, which are basically sand, gravel and cement, are readily available and very low cost. And as I say, they require little maintenance once they're made. And I was speaking to an Indian friend, Devdas, recently, and he told me that Quakers believe that if there's something we know that can be useful to others, we must share it. And I think that's kind of that approach of what Quakers in India are doing with this project.
Wow. It is interesting, the difference in terms of the types of projects in the different countries. And we've kind of skirted around the stuff around lifestyle and privilege a little bit, and I didn't know if you wanted to talk a bit more about that. And how has working for FWCC kind of changed your understanding of this work or at all, or does it make...
I mean, yeah, I'm learning so much through this work. It's really opened my eyes to a lot. I think, climate change is a global problem, and we're all going to be required to make changes to our lives in order to be part of the solution. But lifestyle change is a bit of a sensitive subject. In developed countries, the conversations often make friends feel anxious about loss of comfort, convenience, and even guilty about the part we've played in this and the contribution to the problem. On the other hand, in developing countries, where increased consumption might actually alleviate poverty, global north lifestyles will often hold a great appeal, and even just having lifestyle choices like eating a plant-based diet or changing your energy supplier is a luxury that's not available to many people. Well, then promoting reduced consumption and lifestyle change can be insensitive and inappropriate. So it's quite difficult to sort of message around lifestyle change. But I think what we're asking individual Quakers and meetings and churches to do is to kind of reflect and ask of themselves, what is it that we can do to make a difference? And whatever that response is, that is okay. That comes from them. But we're aware that kind of the actions that are appropriate in one part of the world for a Quaker meeting will not be appropriate in another part of the world.
You alluded to earlier about the spiritual nature of the sustainability stuff. This might be an impossible question to answer, but what is that spiritual underpinning? What is is it just that we acknowledge it as an issue? Is there a deeper grounding to why Quakers care about sustainability? Because some faith groups, most do, but not all do. Is it different in different places? Or?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to, so I can only really give my view on it. I mean, for a lot of people, recognising that we are just one part of this world, and some people will talk about God's creation and protecting God's creation. Others might be motivated by the scripture and sort of the messages that are contained in scripture to care and protect God's creation. For other people, it really intertwines with the Quaker testimonies, which are sort of our Quaker values of peace and equality, simplicity, truth. I think that's all of them. So sustainability has actually been added as a testimony in many parts of the world, which I think is a testament to the kind of importance of this. But really, I see that they can't be separated out. They are also intertwined. And if we are working for peace and justice and equality, then sustainability has to kind of fall under that umbrella because they are so intertwined and interdependent.
Well, I mean, the fact that so many of them involve water, and I mean, I know when I was doing international relations, water wars were a thing that people were talking about, so there's that peace element to the water security and stuff like that.
Of course. We know that kind of climate change is creating greater inequality and it's leading to conflicts and violence. There are many, many examples of this, and we're seeing forced migration increasing and is likely to skyrocket as these problems get worse. So yeah, I think it really does affect everything that Quakers work on around the world. And I mean, although there are these huge variations amongst Quakers and these huge differences, the testimonies do sort of, I mean, as we said, there might be different ways of ordering them or different words to describe them, but really that does sort of flow through Quakerism around the world and is found pretty much everywhere, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's always useful to remember as well that it's not just about having the words for these things, but also about how do we live those things out. That it's, I think, I mean, certainly when I first sort of started to understand them, the fact that there was no specific written down passage, to me kind of spoke to a slight frustration, but also a feeling that actually this is something that grows and changes and adapts to the world around, rather than just being a specific, this is what this means at all times, but actually as the context changes, that our understanding of working on those issues changes as well.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, that's a really good way to describe the testimonies. I should maybe have sort of said that it's not just about saying truth is important or equality is important, but it's actually about how we live our lives and living our lives in accordance with that sort of truth. So, yeah, that was a good explanation.
I mean, I would describe as well that adjusting those to the environment, adjusting those to the context, often comes from a process of like coming from a deeper place, bubbling up from a deeper place.
I think what is probably a bit unique about the Quaker approach to this is taking sort of personal witness alongside political action. And so I think, and as I say, kind of underpinning this all with from a place of deep faith and spirituality. People, as I say, express that in different ways, but I think there is a tendency to focus on one or the other, so being really kind of involved in activism or direct action, and then others sort of focusing really deeply on particular lifestyle changes or greening our meeting houses, changing our light bulbs. And I think what Quakers can sort of bring and offer to this is this approach that goes hand in hand, taking these personal actions alongside political action and pushing for bolder ambition at the national and international levels as well.
Okay. No.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right. Like, it is good to know about that. This is sort of, there's a global community of friends who are working on this. This isn't just sort of like Quakers in the global north imposing something on somebody else. It was a coming together of Quakers around the world to decide, actually, no, we all want to do something in our own areas and in our own way, but we're all trying to do that.
Absolutely.
And that in and of itself feels quite positive and hopeful and in so many ways. Yeah.
And actually, something I should just mention is we work very closely with the Quaker United Nations office, so they're known as QUNO, and they have accreditation at the UN through FWCC as the World Quaker Body, and they have a programme of work on the human impacts of climate change. And so these stories that we're hearing and the responses from friends around the world, it's feeding directly into the international negotiations. And I think, again, that's where Quakers are quite unusual, and we're a small but a very mighty voice. And there are examples where the Quaker United Nations have been called on to provide evidence or input at these international delegations and international meetings, and they share the stories directly from Quakers around the world. So because we have this very flat hierarchy, there is no sense that a farmer in Kenya or a Quaker in the Philippines' voice, it has this direct route, which is quite exciting.
Yeah. I guess we have to be careful to make sure that we keep it that way as well. As perhaps friends in Britain's passions around this issue flare up, that they don't then drown everyone else out or whatever.
Yeah, of course. And I think the other challenge is we're so focused on what we need to do in our particular context, and actually just taking it time and taking a step back to think about the fact that may be what applies to us but isn't necessarily relevant for somebody else, doesn't invalidate what they're doing. It's just, it's all part of this big picture. Yeah,
cool.
That's sure.
So if people have their own stories of work that they're doing around the world, how do they let you know?
Yes, please get in touch. We really love to hear from you. So you can email me. My email address is susannam@fwcc.world, or just go onto our website, which is fwcc.world, and there's a page on sustainability, and there's lots of case studies and videos and resources to help Quakers kind of who want to work on this, but also there's ways to get in touch with us directly through the website. But yeah, please share your stories, because your voices help shape the work that we're doing at the international level. So we really do rely on you for that.
Cool. Great. Thank you very much. It was good to get that global perspective, and I almost it's not surprising when you think about it, but it surprised me how different it was depending where you were in the world. But it still felt like it was holistic, like it was all working. It was all kind of had under this similar umbrella and this similar underpinning. But that focus on water in places like India,
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we talk about, we should save a bit of water here and there, but actually, in comparison to other places around the world, we're not really experiencing the kind of major droughts that are causing crop failures, which are a result of climate change.
Yeah, and not just the water, but just like how much value there is to listening to different perspectives, and that element, I think, that interesting element of privilege, and not assuming that we have the solution to the problem, or being necessarily too overburdened with the guilt, like striking that balance. And it's interesting that a yearly meeting this year, which is where the annual event where Quakers all get together to do some of the bigger thinking and worship and decision making and stuff, is focused on privilege and sustainability. So beginning to see that this is a global thing and how it all maps together and nets together. Yeah,
and I think it's so important to hear from groups around the world about the different things and the different ways that people have been engaged in this work. And with all those differences around the world, as we're based in Britain, we thought we'd also talk to Olivia Hanks, who is the Economics and Sustainability Programme Manager for Quakers in Britain. And we talk a little bit more about why Quakers in Britain have been getting involved in more of the climate change activism, and kind of really dig into what are the changes that we think need to happen within this country in order to kind of really start to tackle the issues of climate breakdown.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
I'm here with Olivia Hanks, who is the Economics and Sustainability Programme Manager. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Elizabeth.
So what do Quakers in Britain think about climate change?
So this is a major concern, a top priority for many Quakers in their witness at the moment. However, the concern for sustainability among Quakers is far from new. Going back as far as the 18th century, Quaker John Woolman in America wrote that, I quote, "The produce of the world is a gift from our gracious Creator to the inhabitants, and to impoverish the earth now to support outward greatness would appear to be an injury to the succeeding age." And it might seem a bit strange to start a conversation about climate change with a quote from the 18th century, but I think that really shows that this is just that our concern, our care for the earth, goes back a long way. And I also find this quote very interesting because of its remarkable similarity to the current UN definition of sustainable development, which is all about enabling people today to meet their needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think that's really at the heart of what we understand by sustainability.
And very much kind of at the forefront of people's minds at the moment with all the sort of climate strikers, that people going out on strike from school and saying this is our future, and that's kind of being squandered by current generations.
Absolutely, and I think Quakers are very much part of this movement that seems to be growing and finally gaining traction. We, Britain Yearly Meeting, committed in 2011 to become a low-carbon sustainable community. But it's not just about us as a Quaker community, it's also about working for change in the wider world, and that's been very much part of many Friends' witness as well, and that's part of what our Economics and Sustainability Programme is all about, is supporting Friends to take action on climate change and climate justice.
So what are the kinds of things people have been doing for now?
So, looking at kind of the central work that Britain Yearly Meeting has done, we were the first church to fully divest from fossil fuels back in 2014. In terms of kind of campaigning work that Friends around the country have been involved with, there has also been some work on divestment campaigns, both local meetings divesting, but also Quakers getting involved in campaigns for councils and other institutions to divest, to pull their money out of fossil fuels. There's also been quite a lot of Quaker involvement in anti-fracking campaigning. So with some other faith groups, some Quakers set up No Faith in Fracking, which is a group that holds regular vigils. Started at the Preston New Road site in Lancashire, and has been part of really catalysing a movement of resistance to fracking.
And people have kind of been throwing around this term climate justice more recently as well. What does that mean in the context of the Quaker work?
Yeah, we're very keen in the work that we do. We're very keen to focus on the climate justice angle as opposed to just talking about climate change, because I think it's very important to stress that this isn't an issue that affects everybody equally. The people most affected and the communities most affected by the impacts of climate change are the ones who've done the least to cause it. It's poor communities, mostly in the global south, who are already feeling the impacts with increasing extreme weather events. They're the least able to adapt and respond because if they don't have the ability to travel, to adapt their infrastructure to deal with extreme weather. They're also, of course, will be the first to suffer from things like food shortages because they're least able to adapt and afford alternatives. We're already seeing huge problems with droughts and unpredictable weather patterns around the world, causing issues with agriculture.
Okay.
So I think that's a really important aspect of this, viewing this as a justice issue. And I think that it can be uncomfortable for us in the West to really confront this. Because really we know deep down that our wealth over the last 200 years in the West has been massively built on exploitation of people and resources, mostly in the global South. And the supposedly cheap energy that we've enjoyed for a long time has come at a high price for a lot of people in the places where fossil fuels have been extracted. And I say all this not to make people feel guilty, because it can be very challenging to confront these issues and to really be honest with ourselves. But it is about telling the truth and acting according to that truth. And I think the principle of climate justice is absolutely crucial to the way that we respond, which is that those nations most responsible and the richest in society who've done the most to cause climate change must do the most now to address it and take responsibility for that.
Yeah, I found that interesting thinking about that in terms of like your John Woolman quote as well, about actually that was around the period of time when, you know, the global north countries were all beginning to industrialise, and he was already beginning, and people were already beginning to think about like, hang on a second, what about the future generations? And then, you know, here we are 200 years later, kind of thinking about, well, what about the fact that we have this long history of industrialisation that has caused these problems?
Yes.
And how can we kind of address that legacy as well?
And while greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change are perhaps the most high profile and obvious manifestation of that now, there are many other parallel ecological crises around us. We're seeing massive biodiversity and habitat loss, acidification of the oceans, depletion of soil and, you know, pollution of the air. And all of these really come from our view of the economy and our view of the earth, which is based on extraction, that we take resources, we use them and we throw things away, which is completely counter to the way that the earth thrives, which is all about cycles and reusing everything. The waste from one thing is food for another, and nothing is wasted. And the further we've got from that understanding, the more problems we've stored up for ourselves and for the living world.
So how do we actually work to change that?
So a lot of the work we've been doing on these issues recently has focused on calling on the government to take action and to update its policies in line with the science. The UK, along with most other countries, signed up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a great step forward, but unfortunately there are very few countries who've taken meaningful action since then to actually update their policies and change their ways of doing things. The UK currently has a target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. That's nowhere near enough to keep us, or to be on the right trajectory to keep us within safe limits of warming. We're calling on the government to, at the very least, update its policies and its targets to reach zero emissions or net zero emissions by 2050. And this is a very fast moving area. There are now some reports saying that actually that won't be enough and we need to move faster than that.
One of the aims coming out of the Extinction Rebellion movement has been about aiming for 2025, and there seems to be a lot of confusion over that like when should we be aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Extinction Rebellion demand is extremely ambitious, and I think they've done that deliberately because they want to stress the urgency of the situation we're facing. I think in some ways the date isn't the most important thing. I mean, it obviously is in terms of what we actually achieve, but in terms of setting the targets, I think the most important thing is that we see some real action from the government, that we move away from simply warm words and pledges and actually start to see us going in the right direction on policies such as renewable energy. I mean, the UK has more subsidies for fossil fuels than any other country in the EU. It is reported to be £10.5 billion a year. That's
Wow.
mostly in tax breaks. And that's far more than the subsidies that go to renewable energy. So we really need to see a shift of that money, that government support, away from oil and gas and into renewables.
And wasn't it cut as well in like 2015 or something?
Yes, so a lot of support for renewable energy has been cut. The feed-in tariff subsidies for solar were cut almost completely, very rapidly, and that's been a real blow to the industry. So we really need to turn this around. I mean, similarly, there was a government commitment to make all new homes zero carbon by 2016 until they scrapped it in 2015, and that's never been replaced.
Okay.
And it's never really been clear whether it was the government's intention to replace it, but there's still been no action to move in that direction. So we've lost some really vital years there on what should be an absolute no-brainer at this stage, that new builds should be fit for the future. We shouldn't be building as though we're still in the 20th century in homes that will have to be retrofitted in a few years' time.
Yeah, because it's more difficult to go back and retrofit something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We need to be getting these things right now. There's no excuses anymore. We know exactly what we need to be doing. The technology's there. It's the political will and the legislative framework that's missing.
Okay. So that 10.4 billion that you mentioned that goes on fossil fuel subsidies, what should we be spending that on instead?
So one easy part of the answer to that is that it should be going to support the development of renewable energy and that to massively speed up that transition to renewables. But there's lots of other aspects to this as well about how we finance the wider transition to a zero carbon society. For instance, around infrastructure, which is the buildings and the networks we rely on for transport, for instance, for communications, essentially all the systems that we will be building over the coming years. Overwhelmingly, those are not built with zero carbon in mind. They're still the materials they use, the building methods, the energy they use, the way that they are used is very much built for the 20th century. And that's a global problem because particularly in poorer countries which are urbanising and kind of developing very fast, they're going to be doing a huge amount of building over the coming years, and it's very important to put the frameworks in place and the incentives in place for that development to happen in a sustainable way.
Okay.
And I think we are starting to see a shift from business and from some influential people in society. So there was a statement recently from the Bank of England that they are going to start declaring climate risk on their balance sheet. There are two aspects to climate risk. One is the financial losses that are sustained when damage is caused by extreme weather that's made worse by climate change. And the other aspect of it is around investments in fossil fuels, which are increasingly being seen not only as morally problematic, but also as just financially risky. That as the kind of legal framework and policy direction changes to move away from fossil fuels, we know that the majority of fossil fuels, the vast majority of what is left in the ground, that in many cases is owned by fossil fuel companies, the rights to extract, they're not going to be able to extract that. It's impossible if we're going to stay within safe limits of global temperature rises. And that's going to result in what's known as stranded assets, where essentially that they can no longer be used, so they lose their value. So that's the financial aspect of climate risk.
So I guess the sort of positive of that then means that actually it might make it almost easier to lobby for divestment of pension funds and things like that from fossil fuels.
Exactly, because that financial argument is there. It makes sense now from a financial perspective as well, and I think investors are, and pension funds and so on are increasingly understanding that. And it's, in my view, it's a massive step forward that the Bank of England has acknowledged that for itself, and it's also called on other financial institutions, so commercial banks, to basically pay a lot more attention to climate risk and take it seriously. And when the Bank of England starts talking like that, there's a sense that things really are beginning to shift.
Okay. So kind of going back to what you were saying about our economic system being based on exploitation of the earth, how do we change that so that that's not what our economic system is based on?
It's a very good question, and I think there are some things that can be changed quite immediately in terms of government policy, the things we've talked about around support for renewable energy, around support for circular economy initiatives, so where we aim to minimise waste and encourage products to be designed in a way that minimises waste, so that they can be reused, things can be repurposed. I think those things are very important, but in a way it goes deeper than that, because I think it's the whole way that we view the world, and I think there's almost a need for a kind of spiritual change there. And again, I think that's where Quakers and other people of faith have a role to play in understanding the shift that is needed for ourselves, but also playing a role in kind of fostering that and facilitating that in the wider world. Because we need to be developing systems that work with nature instead of against it. I mean, this model where we just use up the Earth's resources, whenever that end point is, there is a point where that runs out, whether it's because resources run out or whether, as we now see, we've got to these points of pollution, of climate change, of habitat destruction, where we're endangering our ability to survive on this planet and many other species as well. So I think our whole understanding of how we inhabit the Earth has to change, that we must understand ourselves as part of a living ecosystem, a whole web of life, and be a little bit more humble in our approach to life.
For a lot of people, that seems kind of like almost quite a scary prospect, because that involves changing the very way that we live on the planet. And there's a sort of feeling of reluctance sometimes around, like, I don't really want to have to give up going on holiday and things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear, but actually so much of what we need to do to transform our economy is really win-win and will result in better quality of life and greater equality as well, and happier societies. So to take a simple example of energy efficiency, we need to insulate our homes much better, which will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, our energy consumption, but it's also going to result in lower energy bills and warmer homes. It's going to create jobs. Similarly, encouraging people to switch to zero carbon forms of transport, to walk and cycle more, and not just to ask individuals to do that, but to set up our society so they're designed to make that easy and to make it enjoyable and the most obvious choice. That's going to result in healthier people, less pollution, less unpleasant air pollution that it's causing, that's making a lot of people ill as well. And also will, I think, help to develop our sense of community again.
You kind of talked mostly about like the focus kind of on government policy change and that kind of thing. So why the focus on that rather than changing individual lifestyles?
I think everybody can play a part by thinking about their own individual lifestyle choices. That's easier for some people than others. There are people for whom it isn't practical, for instance, to stop driving. And there are some people for whom they could genuinely make that choice and could think harder about what they do. So I do think that has a role to play, and that also we have much stronger moral authority and credibility if we're seen, at least to some extent, to be practicing what we preach. That said, our focus is about system change, because ultimately we have to go after the power. This is fundamentally an issue of power. This isn't something that we're all equally responsible for, and I think there is a very dangerous narrative that has suited the fossil fuel industry very well, that we are all equally to blame, and it's led to this paralysis where people feel that they can't do anything, that it's all about individuals taking action. And actually, that's a very convenient myth for the fossil fuel industry, because it has blinded people to the fundamental need, which is to take on that power at its source and challenge the fossil fuel industry and the people who are doing very well out of our current extractive fossil fuel-based economy. Ultimately, that's why we want to focus on system change, because it can get much more done than individual lifestyle change. And also because this is something that it isn't about making our lives a bit more unpleasant or a bit more difficult. It's actually about building a society that is happier, healthier, more equal, and that we can actually sustain far into the future. And to do that, we have to address the fundamental problems of extreme wealth and those who are making a fortune out of extracting the fossil fuels that are ultimately killing us and killing the planet.
How can people get involved with pushing for that kind of policy change then?
So the next action that we're kind of focusing on, that we're asking friends to get involved with, is a mass lobby of Parliament that's happening on the 26th of June. So that's in conjunction with the Climate Coalition and various other partners, various organisations taking action on climate change. And the idea is to gather as many people as possible in London, outside Parliament, to ask to speak to their MP, basically. And the idea really is for visibility, to maximise the number of people we get there and show the public support for this issue, much in the way that the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion have done. By mobilising that number of people, they've shown the scale of the demand for change. And so this has a similar goal in some ways, but a slightly different approach and different way of going about that.
Yeah, and more of having a conversation with your individual representative rather than...
Yeah, that's right. And that's very much something that we encourage people to do anyway, that a lot of MPs say they know that climate change is a problem, they are concerned about it, but they're not feeling that pressure from their constituents to act. It doesn't seem to be high on people's agendas. So we really want to show that it is. People do care about this. People are demanding change. So it's a really useful action, actually, to write to your MP or to ask for a meeting with your MP. You don't have to be a policy expert. We can help out with a few key policy asks and a few pointers if that's useful. But essentially, it's about registering your concern and showing that you are paying attention, you are listening, and you are going to hold them to account for what they do.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add?
So yes, so that was, if you're interested in getting involved in the mass lobby of Parliament, that's on the 26th of June. And we're asking people who would like to come along to please tell us they're planning to come, because we want to gather Quakers in one place, and there's going to be, I think, a training of some sort in the morning as well. So if you're interested, you can email philipw@quaker.org.uk.
Well, thanks very much for chatting, taking the time.
Thanks very much for talking to me.
What are your reflections on that then?
I found that really interesting, more because I feel like a lot of the time people have been talking about system change, not climate change, and no one has ever really articulated to me what that might actually look like and how we can rethink the way the society functions at the moment so that we can actually build what we want to see. It always feels a bit nebulous, this whole talk about we need to change everything, and that never really looks very practical. And so now I feel like I understand a little bit more about what are the specific things that could change to have a more sustainable economy.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and that team have been doing a lot of work with various different staff members over a long period of time, thinking about economic models and the underpinnings of the economy and equality, both in terms of all those aspects of social justice, but then also that climate justice element to it. So it's very well-grounded work with lots of interesting thinking and resources going into it.
For a long time, they've been the economics and sustainability team, so that this is very much wound in together for Quakers, and that's sort of an ongoing piece of work as well.
Yeah. I feel like this podcast is quite the big important underpinning stuff, the stuff that has to be thought about and has to be there, and we have to have that grounding to campaign on. But also, it can feel a little bit out of touch, and that's why I think it's really nice that we have the part 2 where we talk to particularly activists and young people who just feel like they had to do something right now, and what they chose to do and how that felt and what it was like.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important aspect, that feeling feeling compelled to take action because something else is pushing you into it. It's not just it's fun, we'll just wander down the street waving some placards, but a feeling of no, I need to go and put my feet on the ground and say, and that might have a personal cost, and to be able to put my feet on the ground and say, no, this is really important, I need you to listen to me, I need you to hear what I have to say on this issue.
Yeah, so we really start to explore that in the second part of this, Quaker Take on climate activism, where we talk to people about the faith and about the individual nature of it, and it all fits nicely together. But we're going to keep you hanging on for that one. Yeah.
And in the meantime, if you want to find out more about Quaker work on this issue in Britain, you can follow @EarthEconQuaker on Twitter, or find Quaker Faith in Action on Facebook.
Yeah, and it can be worth looking on the website as well, in terms of all of the resources about the new economy are on quaker.uk/climate. Also for the World Quaker stuff,
just fwc.world/sustainability.
Yeah, that one then. And if you want to connect with the podcast on social media, it's @BritishQuakers on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and YouTube, where we, slightly behind schedule, upload the podcast with full audio transcripts, accessibility. Otherwise, you can also email me on elizabethp@quaker.org.uk with any comments, suggestions for episodes that you'd like to hear about. Yeah, just thoughts that you have, really. Yeah, you'll be hearing from us again very soon. Thanks for listening. Go well, friends.